On the night of February 9th, 1942, the largest ocean liner in the world caught fire at a Manhattan pier while under armed guard, and within 72 hours the United States Navy struck a secret bargain with the most powerful gangster in New York to make sure nothing like it ever happened again. Charles "Lucky" Luciano, the imprisoned boss of the American Mafia's ruling commission, was sitting inside Clinton Correctional Facility in Dannemora, New York that winter, serving a 30 to 50-year sentence for compulsory prostitution, when word reached him that the government wanted his help. How did a convicted pimp and racketeer, locked away in one of New York State's harshest prisons, end up as an unofficial partner of naval intelligence? And why did the arrangement that eventually freed him also hand the city's peers, its unions, and even pieces of its courtrooms to organized crime for the next 3 decades? That is the story this film is going to unravel, piece by documented piece, because the truth is stranger and more consequential than the myths that grew up around it. To understand how a deal like this could even be conceivable, you have to understand that New York City had never really drawn a hard line between its government and its underworld. The pattern went back generations before Luciano was born. In the Five Points and along the Lower East Side in the late 19th century, Tammany Hall's district leaders survived on the votes and the muscle of street gangs, saloon keepers, and gambling operators, trading protection for loyalty at the polls. When the Lexo Committee investigated the New York Police Department in 1894, it documented systematic extortion of brothels, gambling houses, and pushcart peddlers, with captains literally purchasing their commands and recouping the cost through payoffs. That inquiry forced reforms briefly, but the underlying arrangement, police, politicians, and criminal enterprise sharing the same revenue stream, proved far more durable than any single investigation. By the 1920s, under Tammany's democratic machine, the pattern had simply modernized. Prohibition, which took effect nationally in January 1920, turned bootlegging into the most profitable industry in the city, and every speakeasy from the Bowery to West 52nd Street needed political cover to survive. The men who provided that cover, and the men who ran the beer trucks, were often the same men or close friends of the same men. By 1932, that arrangement had climbed all the way to the mayor's office. Mayor James J. Walker, elected in 1925 and adored for his charm on Broadway, resigned on September 1, 1932, after Judge Samuel Seabury's investigation into magistrate courts and city finances revealed a web of bribery, kickbacks, and unexplained cash gifts running through Walker's administration. Seabury's hearings exposed how bail bondsmen and vice rings paid off police and court officials to keep prostitution and gambling running smoothly across Manhattan, and how a little tin box, a phrase that entered the city's political vocabulary, could hold a bureaucrat's unexplained fortune. Walker fled to Europe rather than face further testimony. The lesson city insiders took from Seabury was not that corruption had ended, but that it needed to be practiced more carefully, and increasingly it were the gangsters, not the ward heelers, who held the real leverage over judges, unions, and city contracts. Into that world rose Salvatore Lucania, a Sicilian immigrant who had come through Ellis Island around 1907 as a boy, grown up on the Lower East Side, and remade himself as Charles "Lucky" Luciano. Alongside allies like Meyer Lansky, a Jewish gangster he had known since childhood, and Frank Costello, a fellow bootlegger with a genius for political friendships, Luciano helped orchestrate the Castellamarese War's bloody end in 1931, murdering the old guard boss Salvatore Maranzano and reorganizing New York's Italian criminal factions into the five-family structure: Genovese, Gambino, Lucchese, Bonanno, and Colombo, though they did not carry those names yet, under a ruling commission designed to prevent future gang wars by settling disputes through negotiation rather than open bloodshed. It was, in its own dark way, an act of institution building, and it made Luciano the most powerful organized crime figure in the country by the mid-1930s, running prostitution rings, loan sharking, and gambling operations that stretched from Harlem to the Garment District. That empire collapsed in a Manhattan courtroom in 1936. Thomas E. Dewey, appointed special prosecutor to break the city's rackets, built a case against Luciano using testimony from dozens of prostitutes and madams who described a citywide bookkeeping and bail system controlled by Luciano's organization. The trial, held in the Court of General Sessions at 100 Center Street, ended in June 1936 with conviction on 62 counts and that 30 to 50-year sentence, among the harshest ever handed down for such charges in New York State history. Luciano was sent first to Clinton Correctional Facility in Dannemora, a maximum security prison in the Adirondacks so remote and cold that inmates called it Little Siberia. It looked, in 1936, like the definitive end of his career. It was not. 6 years later, war changed the calculus entirely. The United States had entered global conflict after Pearl Harbor in December 1941, and New York Harbor had become one of the most important strategic assets on the Atlantic coast, handling roughly a third of the nation's overseas war cargo and troop transport by some Navy estimates. The harbor's vulnerability to sabotage was not theoretical. New Yorkers still remembered the Black Tom explosion of July 1916, when German agents detonated munitions stored on a pier in Jersey City within sight of Manhattan, killing several people and shattering windows across lower New York. So when the SS Normandy, a seized French luxury liner being converted into the troopship USS Lafayette at Pier 88 on the Hudson River near West 48th Street, caught fire on February 9, 1942, and capsized the following day, the Navy's fear of enemy sabotage was immediate and overwhelming. An official investigation ultimately attributed the fire to sparks from a welder's torch igniting stacked life vests, not enemy action, but that finding did little to calm the men responsible for protecting the harbor. If a ship that size could burn and roll onto its side at a heavily guarded Manhattan pier without anyone stopping it, what else was vulnerable? Naval intelligence needed eyes and ears on every pier, every fishing boat, every Union Hall along the waterfront, and it did not have them. That is where the deal begins. In an office at 90 Church Street in Lower Manhattan, headquarters of the 3rd Naval District's Intelligence Unit under Lieutenant Commander Charles Radcliffe Haffenden. Haffenden and his colleagues understood that the New York waterfront was already governed by an entirely separate power structure, the International Longshoremen's Association, and the men who really ran individual piers, many of them affiliated with organized crime. Rather than fight that structure, the Navy decided to use it. Through New York County District Attorney Frank Hogan's office, Naval Intelligence made contact with Joseph Sox Lanza, a racketeer who effectively controlled hiring and labor peace at the Fulton Fish Market on South Street, a market so central to the city's food supply that whoever ran its docks and trucking held enormous informal power. Lanza agreed to help recruit informants among fishermen and dock workers, but he told the Navy plainly that his authority only went so far. If they wanted real cooperation across the harbor, Union locals in Brooklyn, Staten Island, Hoboken, and beyond, they needed the man everyone in that world still answered to, even from behind bars, Charles Luciano. Reaching Luciano meant working through his attorney, Moses Polikoff, and through Meyer Lansky, who by 1942 was running gambling operations from Saratoga Springs to Havana, but had never severed his old partnership with Luciano. Lansky arranged the first direct contact, and in the months that followed, naval officers made repeated visits, first to Clinton Correctional in Dannemora, and then, after officials arranged a transfer that placed Luciano closer to New York City and easier for his lawyers and Navy contacts to reach, to Great Meadow Correctional Facility in Comstock in Washington County, New York, a move that itself signaled how seriously the state was taking the arrangement. What exactly Luciano provided has been debated by historians for decades, and the honest answer is that the evidence is murkier than the legend that later grew around it. What is documented is that word went out along the docks, through channels tied to Lanza and to Luciano's old associates, discouraging labor unrest and encouraging cooperation with naval intelligence on watching for suspicious activity, foreign agents, and unexplained boat traffic. Fishing crews connected to mob-influenced locals reportedly helped patrol coastal waters for German submarine activity. Less certain and more contested among historians is the claim, repeated often in later journalism and popular film, that Luciano's Sicilian contacts materially assisted American and British intelligence ahead of the 1943 invasion of Sicily, Operation Husky. Some officers involved in the operation later testified to Luciano's usefulness in vague terms. Other historians have concluded that this part of the story was inflated after the fact, partly by Luciano himself and partly by officials eager to justify what came next. While that quiet arrangement developed inside a prison cell 200 miles from the city, a parallel scandal was unfolding in Manhattan's courts that revealed just how deeply organized crime had penetrated the machinery of city government. In 1943, District Attorney Frank Hogan's office, running a wiretap investigation into Frank Costello, recorded a phone call between Costello and Thomas Aurelio, a magistrate who had just secured the Democratic and Republican nominations for a seat on the New York State Supreme Court, one of the most powerful judicial positions in the state. On the tape, Aurelio thanked Costello effusively, saying, "I want to thank you for everything you have done," and calling the nomination a fine job well done. Costello replied, "Congratulations, it went over perfect. When I tell you something is in the bag, you can rest assured." The recording became public and produced a genuine scandal. Newspapers ran headlines, bar associations demanded Aurelio withdraw, and the state briefly seemed poised to punish a judge for his open alliance with the underworld. Aurelio refused to withdraw his candidacy. The courts declined to remove him from the ballot, and in November 1943 the voters of New York elected him to the bench anyway. It was a small, sobering data point proving that the public's tolerance for gangster influence over city institutions was higher than anyone in the reform movement wanted to admit, and it cemented Costello's reputation as the man newspapers began calling the Prime Minister of the Underworld, a fixer whose reach extended into Tammany Hall's leadership, into Albany, and into courtrooms that were supposed to be above his influence entirely. Back at Great Meadow, Luciano's usefulness to the Navy, whatever its true extent, was about to be converted into freedom. In 1945, Luciano's attorneys formally petitioned for clemency, citing his wartime service to the government. The petition landed on the desk of a man with a very particular history with Luciano, Thomas E. Dewey, the same prosecutor who had sent him to prison in 1936, was now the sitting governor of New York State, elected in 1942 and again in 1946. On January 3, 1946, Governor Dewey commuted Luciano's sentence with one binding condition: deportation to Italy, the country he had left as a child nearly 40 years earlier and had not seen since. Roughly a month later, in early February 1946, Luciano was placed aboard the SS Laura Keene at a Brooklyn pier and sent across the Atlantic, exiled from the city he had spent his adult life building into a criminal empire, almost exactly 4 years after the burning of the Normandy had first pulled the Navy into his cell. Dewey's decision drew immediate criticism, and the political pressure over the appearance of a quiet payoff to a convicted racketeer eventually forced him to commission an internal review. William B. Herlens, a special assistant attorney general, conducted a lengthy investigation into the entire wartime relationship between Luciano and naval intelligence, interviewing dozens of officers, agents, and underworld figures involved. Herlens completed his report in 1954, and it concluded that Luciano's cooperation had been real, though narrower and less decisive than the rumors claimed. Governor Dewey, protecting his own reputation as he eyed future national office, chose not to release the report publicly. It remained sealed in state archives for more than 2 decades, only becoming available to historians and journalists in 1977, long after Dewey's death, which meant that for a generation, New Yorkers debated the Luciano deal almost entirely on the basis of rumor, tabloid speculation, and the gangsters' own self-serving retellings from exile in Italy and later Havana. The deportation of one man, however useful he had briefly been to the war effort, did nothing to loosen organized crime's grip on the actual machinery of the New York waterfront, and that is where the deal's true cost became visible over the following decade. The docks that Luciano's associates had helped secure during the war remained, after the war, under the daily control of mob-connected Union power. The International Longshoremen's Association, led nationally by Joseph P. Ryan, operated through a hiring practice called the Shape-Up, in which dock workers gathered each morning at the pier gates and hiring bosses, many beholden to organized crime, chose who worked that day and who did not, a system that made kickbacks, loan sharking, and cargo theft nearly impossible to stop, because any worker who complained could simply be denied a day's wage indefinitely. In Brooklyn, the Red Hook and Bush terminal piers fell under the influence of Albert Anastasia, a commission boss sometimes called the Lord High Executioner, and his brother Anthony Anastasio, who ran ILA Local 1814 and effectively decided who unloaded cargo along that stretch of the East River waterfront for years. It took a newspaper series, not a courtroom, to force the public reckoning that Luciano's clemency had quietly postponed. Beginning in November 1948, New York Sun reporter Malcolm Johnson published a 24-part investigative series titled Crime on the Waterfront, documenting extortion, cargo pilferage, loan sharking, and violence controlled by racketeers embedded inside ILA locals across the harbor. The series won the Pulitzer Prize for local reporting in 1949 and eventually inspired the 1954 film On the Waterfront, directed by Elia Kazan, whose depiction of a lone longshoreman testifying against corrupt union bosses drew on real testimony from dock workers like Anthony DiVincenzo, who had cooperated with investigators despite threats. The fictionalized film compressed and dramatized real events, and viewers should understand it as art inspired by documented corruption, rather than a literal record of it. But the underlying rot it depicted was entirely real and had been operating, essentially unchecked, since before the war that had briefly made gangsters into government partners. Public pressure, generated by Johnson's reporting, fed directly into the creation of the New York-New Jersey Waterfront Commission, established by a bi-state compact that both states' legislatures approved and Congress ratified in 1953. The commission was designed specifically to dismantle the shape-up system, license dock workers and hiring supervisors, and screen out individuals with serious criminal records from waterfront employment, the first sustained institutional attempt to separate organized crime from the physical machinery of New York's ports since the Navy had deliberately fused the two during the war. It worked only partially and slowly. Mob influence on the docks persisted in weakened form for decades afterward, but the shape-up itself was gradually eliminated over the following years. National television gave the public its next major look at the arrangement's architecture in 1951, when Senator Estes Kefauver's special committee investigating organized crime held hearings across the country, including sessions in New York City, that drew unprecedented viewership. Frank Costello agreed to testify only on the condition that cameras not show his face, so TV's audiences across the country watched his hands, restless, gesturing, sometimes gripping a water glass, while his voice described a lifetime of gambling operations and political connections. The hearings did not convict Costello of a crime, but they made his name and his relationship to Tammany Hall's leadership a matter of national embarrassment, and they placed a spotlight on the same underworld political network that had produced the Aurelio wiretap scandal 8 years earlier. It was during this same period that federal and state investigators began mapping, in far greater public detail than ever before, how the commission structure Luciano had helped build in 1931 continued operating as the governing body of American organized crime, with New York's 5 families at its center. That structure suffered its most public embarrassment on November 14, 1957, when a New York State police trooper investigating unusual traffic near the small town of Appalachian, in Tioga County, stumbled onto what appeared to be a large gathering of well-dressed men at the estate of Joseph Barbara. Dozens of mob figures from across the country, gathered for what investigators believed was a National Commission meeting, fled into the surrounding woods as police set up roadblocks. More than 60 men were eventually identified and questioned. The Appalachian meeting proved almost nothing in a legal sense. No one was charged with a crime that day that held up on appeal, but it proved something enormous in a symbolic sense, confirming publicly for skeptical Americans and even skeptical FBI officials that a coordinated national criminal organization with deep roots in New York truly existed, and that its reach ran through docks, unions, and courtrooms exactly as the earlier scandals had suggested. The federal government's congressional investigations kept widening through the late 1950s. The McClellan Committee, running from 1957 into 1959 with a young Robert F. Kennedy serving as chief counsel, focused primarily on Teamsters corruption but also examined the deeper pattern of labor racketeering that the Luciano-era waterfront deal had normalized. Union treasuries looted, employers extorted for labor peace, and rank-and-file workers denied any real voice in locals controlled by men with commission ties. It took until the 1970s, with the passage of the Federal Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act in 1970, for prosecutors to gain a legal tool capable of targeting the commission itself rather than individual crimes committed by individual members, a structural response, finally, to a structural problem that had existed openly since Luciano organized the 5 families in 1931, and that the wartime deal had allowed to entrench itself even further. That tool reached its most decisive New York application in 1985 and 1986, when United States Attorney for the Southern District of New York Rudolph Giuliani brought what became known as the Commission Case, indicting the heads of the Genovese, Gambino, Lucchese, Bonanno, and Colombo families simultaneously under RICO, charging them collectively with running organized crime as a criminal enterprise rather than prosecuting scattered individual offenses. The trial, held in federal court in Manhattan, ended in November 1986 with convictions of the surviving defendants, Anthony Salerno, Carmine Persico, Anthony Corallo among them, on charges that carried effective life sentences. It was the most significant single blow to the commission structure since Luciano himself had built it more than 50 years earlier, and it marked the practical end of the era in which the heads of New York's mafia families could operate as an acknowledged, semi-institutional power alongside the city's legitimate government. The Fulton Fish Market. The very place where Joseph Sox Lanza had first opened the door between naval intelligence and Charles Luciano back in 1942, remained under some degree of organized crime influence for decades after the war ended, its trucking and unloading contracts quietly taxed by racketeers well into the 1980s and 1990s. It took a sustained effort by federal prosecutors and, later, Mayor Giuliani's administration in the 1990s to finally break that specific grip. And the market itself was eventually relocated in 2005 from its centuries-old home on South Street in Lower Manhattan to a new facility in Hunts Point in the Bronx, closing out a chapter of waterfront history that stretched back, in an unbroken line of mob influence, to the exact deal struck in a prison visiting room during the darkest early months of America's war. Standing back from all of it, the deal that let gangsters run parts of New York was never a single signature on a single piece of paper. It was a decision repeated across decades by prosecutors, governors, naval officers, and Tammany power brokers alike, that the fastest and most convenient way to secure loyalty, labor peace, or wartime cooperation in a city this large and this fractured was to work through the men who already controlled the streets, the piers, and the union halls, rather than to dismantle their power outright. Thomas Dewey convicted Luciano as a prosecutor and freed him as a governor, and both decisions were, in their own moment, defensible acts by a man managing real threats to public safety and national security. But each time the state borrowed the underworld's cooperation, it also borrowed the underworld's terms, and New York spent the better part of the 20th century paying down that debt, on the docks where dockworkers waited for a shape-up boss's nod, in courtrooms where a wiretapped phone call could still not stop a judge from taking his seat, and in a fish market that took prosecutors and a mayor nearly 50 years to finally clean up. The city likes to remember its gangsters as colorful outlaws operating outside the system. The more uncomfortable truth, documented in Senate hearings, sealed reports, and courtroom transcripts, is that for a very long stretch of New York's history, the underworld was not outside the system at all. It was quietly, deliberately built into it.